Hi, this is our week 1 training, and it's all based upon the first core principle that we talked about in the orientation call, all around eating for nourishment and pleasure. And it sounds quite simple really, doesn't it, to eat for nutritional purposes but also for pleasure, but it's surprising how many of us actually don't really follow those 2 key principles, and there's lots of reasons why, and we're going to sort of explore that a little bit throughout this training module. So eating for nourishment and eating for pleasure, like I say, it sounds really simple, but actually it can feel quite scary when you start to think about it. And for so many of us, especially those of us that have spent a big proportion of our lives following the sort of restrictive pathway that conventional and traditional diets often are formed around, only to be shortly followed by the sort of swinging of the pendulum, so going from restriction to overeating. And if you're anything like me, I spent a good 25 years of my life sort of following those patterns, either following really strict diets to the letter or creating my own rules around those diets and then wondering why I wasn't losing any weight, or just completely falling off the wagon altogether. And that cycle sometimes might have been a matter of months. Certainly the more diets I tried, I found my ability to stay focused and to stay on those restrictive ways of eating harder and harder. So often the time that I was able to go around that cycle got shorter and shorter, to the point where actually even the very thought of restriction kind of filled me with dread as I guess my awareness grew that actually that wasn't the right way for me. So when I set these activities for you guys, I don't do it from a place of thinking you automatically are going to jump into action, because something that often underpins change, especially when it's change around the way that we've been eating, because eating and food and weight and all of that holds such an emotional attachment to it. So even though logically we know we want things to be different, sometimes our fearful inner child, you'll hear me talking about our inner and outer child. The inner child is our emotional core. It's the part of us that, holds the shame and the guilt and the fear associated with changing our eating patterns. And what's familiar to us is changing our eating in the restrictive way. And I'm stood here and I'm kind of saying to you, no, you've got to start giving yourself permission to eat and eat for nourishment and eat for satisfaction. And for a lot of us, that's kind of a bit alien for us. So that's kind of the first thing that I want us to explore as part of this training. And by now you should have received your workbook. And for those of you that have got printers, print them out, because it's always nice to have something tangible to write on. But for those of you that haven't, work off your screens and then jot stuff down in your notebooks. And the whole process of actually writing stuff down in itself is really therapeutic. It kind of gets the left and right parts of your brain working, and that really helps to implement change. So don't set these activities just for you to read. Get involved with them. The more you get involved and the more you write stuff down, the more the change process is going to work for you on a deeper level. So the first thing that I want us to give some consideration to are your fears, and talk a little bit more about this in the workbook that you're going to print out. But think about what are the fears that you have associated with eating for nourishment and eating for pleasure, and giving yourself permission to eat. So now you've had a chance to explore some of the fears that you may have around giving yourself permission to eat and eating for satisfaction. It's really important that we start to acknowledge and honour those fears, because it is fear that holds us back a lot of the time. And once we actually start to give a voice to some of those fears, it can really help us to kind of hold that little inner child's hand as we go through this process. So the next thing that I'm inviting you to explore throughout this training is what might be getting in the way for you. And there's lots of reasons, there's lots of things that get in the way, but I've kind of isolated 4 of them that I want to encourage you to work through for yourself. And the first one are food rules. We are born into this world, and from day one of birth, we are being given rules around food, and some of them are verbal rules, others are just by experiencing what our family members do, what they eat, what they don't eat, so we are constantly picking up different messages around food. And then as we grow, we go to school and there's different food rules at school, and then we enter into the world of the dieting culture world, and that is absolutely littered with food rules. So that's going to be the first thing that we look at, and there's going to be like there's a questionnaire there for you to fill in, because sometimes it's really hard to think about the food rules that might be relevant for you. So I've given you a questionnaire to just kind of get your mind thinking a little bit, and it's really simple. Go through the questionnaire and answer whether that applies to you or whether that doesn't apply to you. And then what I want you to do is just work on the ones that apply to you, and you're guided through this in the workbook. So you're going to do a little bit of exploration, and you're going to do a little bit of thought around where some of that stuff comes from in that exercise around your food rules. You're going to do a similar exercise around family food rules, because you will have rules that are around food generally, but then you'll also have some of those key messages that were around and given to you as a child growing up. And our childhood is a huge influencer of our eating, and so this is a really valuable one to actually give some consideration to what food messages you received as a child, what food rules were around. And again, I've given you a list of scenarios there that you may or may not relate to, just to kind of get your mind flowing. It's always nice to have those options to think about, because sometimes we don't give consideration that they are rules because they're so ingrained in us. So the first couple of areas that we're going to look at are around your food rules and your family rules. Then we're going to start looking at the good old good and bad food list. And although technically that is a food rule, this is a really powerful one. And if you think you don't have an unconscious, or for many of us a very conscious, good and bad food list, I would question and challenge that a little bit. So this kind of language around food is very all or nothing, isn't it? And as humans, we do like to be a bit all or nothing. If we look at it in terms of rigidity and chaos, we like rigidity. It makes us feel safe and in control, and that's why diets feel so appealing to us, because they're rigid. You know, we go off to Slimming World and they give us the book to follow, and it makes us feel safe as long as we follow the rules. But unfortunately, you know, we have that pesky outer child that doesn't like following the rules, and so when the diet says you can have 2 slices of bread, we want 4, and then we get caught up in this, oh well, I'll have 4 today and then I won't have any tomorrow. God, I remember those days so well. So good and bad food, it's like these polar opposites, isn't it? And the thing about rigidity is it makes us feel safe, but eventually we go over to this chaotic world, which then kind of unsettles us, and we're constantly trying to get back to this rigid place, and we're very rigid around food. And that includes the good and bad food list, where if we eat lettuce and chicken and all these things that we deem to be on the good food list, we feel good. We get to the end of the day and we put a big tick in the box and we say, oh, I've been good today. I've been good today. But of course, it works in the opposite way as well, whereby we have a list of bad foods, crisps, chocolate, cheese, whatever, cake, whatever's on there for you. And of course, when we eat it, we attach this moral status, and we generally feel bad, and we get to the end of the day, and if we've eaten some of those foods, even if we've given ourselves permission to, we put a big cross in the box, and that trips off that cycle of feeling guilty and ashamed. And for many of us, this is such an ingrained process, we don't even really realise that it's going on. And so we're going to shine a light a little bit on that as well. And you're going to be invited to kind of write down your good and bad food list, and then a little bit later on in the training you're going to be invited to do something called exposure therapy, where I'm going to invite you to start to pick some of those foods off the bad food list and start desensitizing yourself by having them more regularly. And it's not about a free-for-all and going all in and trying them all at once, but it is about just starting to incorporate them into your eating regime on a daily basis. So we start to become desensitized, and we start to move away from this really ingrained good and bad foods, which often invites us to feel good and bad alongside eating them. And the last part, so I said we're going to cover off 4 things. We're going to look at the food rules, the family rules, good and bad foods. And the last one we're going to look at is comments from other people, or perceived comments from other people, because we live in our own heads sometimes, don't we? And we kind of can create stories about what we think other people will think. So we have a combination of comments that are directly made to us about our eating, about our weight, but we also have that perception, that story that we tell ourselves about what people may or may not think. I know for me personally, when I was bigger, if I was going out for a meal, I would have a tendency to eat before I went out, because then I would then eat something like a salad when I was out, so people didn't think, oh God, you know, is she really eating that? But then I kind of found myself trapped in this place of thinking, well, as if they're going to be fooled by me having a salad. So it was like I couldn't win whatever way, but I know that I spent time in my own head predicting what I thought other people might think of me, and that certainly interfered with my food choices, and that would stop me from eating for nourishment and eating for pleasure. So they're the 4 things that we're going to cover in that area of the training this week. We're then going to move on to really looking at eating for nourishment and pleasure. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the workbook, but you are invited to try out an intuitive eating technique. And I know I've already spoken to some of you about mindful eating, okay, but it is a really important part of learning to really enjoy the food that we're eating. And it's not just about the taste, it's about the whole environment. It's about really stopping and thinking about what it is that we want to eat. You know, we're so busy these days, quite often we are just grabbing things on the hoof. And you know what, to a degree there has to be an element of that. You know, I prepare my meals in the morning, and you know, maybe I don't always fancy that by the end of the day, but I'm in a routine and that's kind of what I do. So I set myself up to win in those scenarios. You know, I know by 5 or 6 o'clock I'm knackered, and the more likely I am to not want to prepare something nutritious. So I kind of do the prep work in the morning. That works for me. I know it's there. Then if Gary gets in from work, he can actually cook it because the recipes are there, but equally I know that it's then all prepped and I've just got to cook it, and that increases my risk, my chances, of actually cooking and eating something that is made from scratch. So I'm gonna talk you through the mindful eating process, if you like. So it really is about slowing down and really starting to tune in to what you're eating, and you're going to be invited to give that a bit of a practice. And again, it's something new. If you've never taken time to practice mindful eating before, or if you have but it hasn't lasted very long, you know, this is the thing, anything that we're doing for the first time or isn't automatic, it feels awkward and uncomfortable, but the more we practice it, the more it becomes easier. And a couple of tips I would say is choose a meal time or a snack time where there's not many people around, because it's really hard to practice these techniques if you're getting disturbed or distracted by people around you. So if you have a meal time where you do tend to eat on your own, that would be a really nice one to start getting used to this intuitive eating process or this mindful eating process. And in your workbooks, it's going to talk you through the things to consider, and it's going to invite you to try the mindful eating exercise at least 6 times over the next week. If you can do it more, then great, but try to do it at least once a day over the coming week, and just kind of notice what you notice and see if you find that you actually are eating less because you're more attuned to what you're eating. So this is a lovely practice to get into, and it is a building block, and we're going to be building on these blocks over the next 4 weeks. And the last thing that we're going to be exploring and looking at this week is your eating environment. So the mindful eating and the intuitive eating kind of looks at the process of eating, but I also want you to look at your eating environment. You know, so many of us are eating when we're distracted. That's a big one. But also, you know, if you're sitting down to eat in the evening and you've got kids around the table that are making a lot of noise, if it's quite stressful, this is going to have an influence over your pleasure that you get from eating. And it's no wonder if you've eaten your dinner and you've come away from the table and you don't feel overly nourished and you don't feel overly satisfied, the chances are you're going to be reaching for something later in the evening. So Lots to think about this week, guys. You've got a lovely workbook to work through. If you do have any questions about any of this stuff, please reach out to me. Also, do come and offer your comments as you work through it. If something comes up, come and share it in the group so we can all sort of share that experience with you. And also comment on other people's comments. If you relate to something that gets said, come and offer that. So we start to just build a discussion in the group around some of this stuff. So this week's training is focusing on the nourishment and pleasure side of things. Over the coming weeks, we'll start to explore the emotional side of things as well. So enjoy.